Forced undercover for 6 years, and my best friend steals my fiance. Part 3. It has been 2 weeks since my last post, and unfortunately Tracy and Frank haven't allowed me to my son, but that has just motivated me to work harder. But I wanted to talk about Frank. We had been best friends. I even looked up to him. I thought he was so cool at school, and he used to visit me all the time. He knew how to talk to people, and so he easily got my parents to adore him. When we were 12, he didn't come to school for a couple of days, and I had overheard the teachers talking about how he had witnessed the police kill his own father and what a shame it was that he had no other relatives and that he was probably going to end up in foster care. When I got home, I told my parents what I had heard, and because they felt sorry for him, they had reached out to the police who had gotten them in touch with Child Protective Services, and to cut a long story short, they ended adopting him. Now, the best friend that I looked up to was my adopted brother. We all felt sorry for him, especially my parents, and he got special treatment. And generally, I didn't mind because I knew what he was going through, pain that I couldn't understand. But he could sometimes be mean and seduce a girl I liked, and afterwards he would act all innocent and convince me he was looking out for me. Because of how his father died, there was one taboo in the house: the police. For a few years after his father's death, whenever Frank heard sirens or saw a police officer, he would have a panic attack. It was so bad that we were forbidden about talking about the police and even changing the channel if anything police-related came on. He did eventually improve, but my parents still forbade it in the house. As we got older, we drifted apart, though I still considered him my best friend, and when I finished school, I moved out. There wasn't enough money to send both of us to college, so my parents were paying for Frank's tuition and board. And when I was about 20, I decided to join the police. Because I knew they would disapprove, I didn't tell my parents or Frank. I just told them I worked in security. A year later, I met Tracy. I would like to say it was love at first sight, but we actually didn't get along at first. She was my neighbor, and I found out that she had a stalker, so even though we didn't get along, I thought it best to walk her from her apartment to her car and vice versa when I saw her. At first, she was rude about it, but eventually we started talking and became more friendly. We even went for coffee a few times, until one day the stalker attacked her, but luckily I was nearby and was able to put him in a headlock until police arrived and took him away. She was in shock, so I don't think she noticed how I knew the officers. After this event, I had no more reason to walk her to her car, so I asked her on a date, and she said yes. That was how we started dating. A couple of months later, I took her home to meet my parents. When I took her to meet my parents, Frank was also there. And he was his usual charming self, but Tracy barely looked at him. My parents loved Tracy. At this time, Tracy already knew what my job was, but also knew to keep it a secret, which she did. A couple of days later, Frank crashed his car, and it had to go in for repairs. My parents asked me to lend my car to Frank as he needed it for college and his part-time job. I tried to explain I also needed it, but they eventually talked me into lending it to Frank. Not even a week after lending it to Frank, he called to tell me it had been stolen. When I reported it stolen, it was found within a couple of hours in a parking lot. The officer that found it noticed it wasn't locked, and when he opened the door, noticed some drugs lying on the floor. If I hadn't been a police officer, I could have been in big trouble. Luckily, after an investigation, which included a drug test, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. At the time, I had thought that the car thief had dropped the drugs in the car by accident. 2 years later, I transferred to narcotics. I had just turned 24. It was a lot harder than before, with lots of pressure to have to constantly prove myself. And during all of this, I had kept in contact with Frank. And because of his bias towards the police, I never had to worry about running into any of my buddies from work when we went out together. And then a little over a year later, I proposed to Tracy, and she said yes. When I asked Frank to be my best man, he had told me he would be honored to. And then 8 months later, Tracy had told me she was pregnant. I was so happy. I was doing a job I loved that challenged me, was marrying the love of my life, and was now going to be a father. My life was perfect, at least until 2 months later. Looking back at my relationship with Frank, I realized now that only I thought of him as my best friend. I had become so used to letting him get his way, at first because I felt sorry for him, but then later on because it had become the norm. Even as I cop, I allowed myself to be pushed around, which is why I ended up going undercover in prison instead of calling my superior's bluff. And Frank had become so used to taking what he wanted from me that when Tracy didn't even look at him, he became obsessed with taking her from me. And he thinks he has won, but he doesn't realize that I am no longer the same man I once was. In prison, I had to learn to stand up for myself. If I let myself be pushed around, it would have been over, and my love for Tracy and my child will not allow me to lose. And now I have to get back to work.